Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues that affect the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden. I'll be your host for today's program. I'm a professor of health informatics at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, and I direct a program at TIER Memorial Hermann called Independent Living Research Utilization. We've got an interesting program for you today, and before I introduce our guest, I'd like to ask you a question, one that will come up during the course of our conversation, and you may be interested to know about it. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and signed in 1990. However, since then, there have been some significant amendments to the law, and I'd like to know, if you know, what year those amendments were passed in. We'll talk about it during the course of today's program. Now, if you'll take a little break with me, we'll be right back, and we'll introduce today's guest. Hi, I'm Lex Frieden, and you're watching Focus on Abilities. We've got an interesting program today, so I'm glad you tuned in. Our guest today is Diego Demaya. Diego works at TIER Memorial Hermann at a program that you'll hear more about during the course of our show today. And Diego, I wanted to welcome you to Focus on Abilities.
Thanks so much, Lex.
Diego, you're an attorney, I know that. Your job at the ADA Center is to do what?
I'm basically a legal analyst, and I provide technical assistance and policy guidance on the Americans with Disabilities Act and related disability laws to a 5-state region.
So the organization you work for at TIER is the ADA Center.
Right, the Southwest ADA Center.
Can you tell us a little bit about the ADA Center?
Yeah, the Southwest ADA Center is part of a it's one piece of a 10-piece network across the country, and we cover the 5-state region, which includes Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, and what am I missing? New Mexico, I think.
Yeah.
And so, we take calls through our basically what's otherwise known as the ADA hotline, and of course we take questions through our email system, and then people who call us or send us emails or correspondence, and we deal with all kinds of subjects relating to disability laws, basically.
So that's what you're doing now, Diego. You've been there for a long time, but before that, you had a lot of experience personally. I know that at one point in your career you were a radio disc jockey. I know you went to school in New York. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in Long Island, New York, and went to most of my high school there, and then with work opportunities brought my parents here to Houston in 1980. So then I finished high school here in Houston. So I really do consider myself a Houstonian. I've seen this city grow, and expand and become very, very interesting. And then I went to college here at U of H, and I got 2 degrees from there, give or take a few years. And then, of course, I had work in between all that time here, and I used to work for what is now known as Sight into Sound, which is a radio station, a very small radio station, nonprofit organization that reads newspapers and magazines, printed material basically to people with disabilities, not just visually impaired, but the elderly as well. Anybody who can't hold a book, basically.
Diego, you yourself experience a disability. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I think that I've been attracted to all these different kinds of jobs because I have a low vision impairment myself, which I've had to grow with all of my life since birth. And so I have low vision. I'm legally blind, as the term goes. And,
so that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
You are blind. I mean, according to the IRS and other kinds of
yes.
measures, you're an individual who is blind.
Right.
And yet you describe yourself as being low vision, which implies that despite the fact that you are, quote, blind, you also have vision, you can see. Right. A lot of people get confounded by that. What's that mean exactly?
That's been one of the most fascinating things to help people with, because I mentor people, at the college level and high school level. And, it's difficult to be in the low vision category because if you use a cane, people know that you're blind. If you don't use a cane or you prefer not to use a cane, then people don't know. And sometimes that can make it either embarrassing or difficult because, there are limitations to being low vision, like not driving, for instance. But it's a very interesting category to be in because you're sort of in the twilight zone. You're in between being blind and not being blind. And some people think sometimes that's worse, whether to, it's better to be blind or sighted and not in between.
So in between, what's that, does that mean, you just said you couldn't drive, but can you ambulate? Can you walk okay? You need guidance when you're...
Yeah, in my case, I can ambulate. Of course, places that are dark are more difficult. I have a problem of not having enough light sensitivity, so for me, it's never enough lighting in a room. And by the same token, I also have a problem with bright light, so I have to wear sunglasses when I'm outside. So, I can ambulate, but for instance, if I go out at night or if I go traveling to the city using public transportation, I use my cane. It's the insurance policy.
Are you apt to trip over something that you don't see or bump into something that you're not aware is there? What are the repercussions?
Lex, low vision impairments come in all forms and shapes. It's like a typical disability. It can be in any way. And in my case, I have no depth perception whatsoever, so I really wouldn't see steps or curves coming up, even if it's daytime. So that's the kind of issue that I have, in addition to not having enough lighting to be walking around at night without a cane.
And is it constant? I mean, each day, does it change? Or ever since you discovered you had this disability, it's been fairly stable?
Yeah, I have a long history of eye surgeries to actually save my only seeing eye. So, I have one of those legal blindness issues that is sort of amorphous to quantify in any way. I have better days, and then I have bad days,
And Diego, I guess this is one of the issues that we have to address that's more difficult, as you described it, than any other with people who have disabilities or those who are trying to accommodate disability, is that each one of our disabilities is so different, you can't put us in a category.
No. I strive really hard to, when I'm talking to employers over at the ADA Center, when I get calls from HR professionals and attorneys and judges and you name it, when they call us for some kind of guidance on the law, I make it a priority to stress to them that everybody's different because people seem to, for some reason, want to pigeonhole everybody that has a disability. And everybody comes in different shapes and sizes. So,
well, and I guess the accommodations are different accordingly as well. Some people had the impression when the ADA was passed that the only thing needed for accommodating people with mobility impairments was to put ramps where there were steps and elevators where there were change in levels.
Right.
But that's not true. And the same thing is true of blindness. It's not everybody doesn't need large print and everybody doesn't need Braille.
No, and one of the most recurring issues, in this day and age is the fact that there are people with hearing loss. This country has a huge problem with hearing loss. And, because of industries, because of the type of work that you might have done and so forth, and age, of course, and then disease or conditions that take your hearing away, people who are, quote unquote, hard of hearing, because, you see the phrase deaf or hard of hearing under the laws. That's the language they use because there are people who can't, who have hearing. And so they have kind of a similar issue that I go through sometimes where people think that they're, quite abled and they actually have a hearing impairment. So it's an uphill fight, that everybody has to struggle with their individual, disability.
And accommodations are individual. You learn yourself how to accommodate yourself. Is it frustrating sometimes to try to describe to other people the accommodations that you need and have them make assumptions about what they can do to provide those accommodations?
It used to be a lot more frustrating, as I'm sure you know, in the past. But as technology develops nowadays, it's a little easier. But I've always found it to be a great way to show people what that means, what accommodating somebody means, is if you can show them. if you can actually show them what happens, this is why I need this accommodation. And so in my case, I do large print, for instance.
Diego, communications is also very important.
Yeah.
I know that many people with disabilities who have limitations either with vision or with reach or with grasp, in a restaurant, for example, someone will come to take their order and they won't be able to access the menu. They try to explain that to somebody and it gets very confusing very quickly if they're not articulate about that. I mean, what do you do in those kinds of situations?
Well, it depends always on the context of what you're doing on your daily routine. I find it that honesty is the best way, and to tell people that, you might need certain kinds of assistance. But it really depends because, I have a lot of questions I'm given a lot of questions by people who call at the center asking, when do I disclose my disability, and that's always a very touchy subject. So,
is there basic advice about that?
The advice is basically that again, we have context, depends on what you're doing. There's a difference between being a job applicant and when do you disclose your disability as opposed to being an employee and then you develop a disability or you develop a need to request that reasonable accommodation. So, certainly you have to disclose having a disability, especially if you have sort of a quote-unquote hidden one,
so
kind of like I do.
You would advise people to disclose, but
Right.
the timing of when they do that may be important because they don't want to put themselves in a position where they may be face discrimination as a result of their admonition.
Yeah, and Lex, there's an ongoing debate about that among the professionals who train people to go find jobs, people with disabilities. The VR industry, vocational rehab industry, for instance, the debate is, if you when do you disclose having, like I mentioned, a hidden disability like I do, because regrettably, the law doesn't reach into the private prejudices of an individual. It's just not going to happen. And so all you can do is try to gauge, based on what's happening at that moment in your life, okay, this is a time for me to mention this disability.
So to some extent, you have to trust
Yes, you do.
other people to manage appropriately the information you provide them.
And you have to take a chance, and you have to be willing to not be afraid.
Okay, Diego, we promised to give an answer to a question at the beginning of the show. We'll come back to that. I'll bet you know the answer. You work with it every day. Your job now at the ADA Technical Assistance Center, the ADA Center, is to provide answers to questions. We've got some more for you right after we're going to take a break here. So please stay tuned. We'll be back with more Focus on Abilities. Thanks. Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. We're here today with Diego Demaya from the Southwest ADA Center at Tier Memorial Hermann. Diego, you must get a lot of calls every day from people who have questions about the ADA and related legislation. About how many calls a day do you take on the 800 line that you answer?
Ooh, we get a lot of calls. But per day we get, 30, 40 phone calls a day, at least.
So it's not just you answering the phone there?
No, well, it's typically me, but then we have backup people who answer the phone, and depending on the type of question, it's either going to come to me or they'll answer the question themselves.
Well, and we have other skilled technical assistants.
Sure, we do.
People with different specialties, attorneys and
Right.
otherwise. In fact, the service is bilingual, is it not?
Correct. Yeah,
We have Spanish. And Diego, what do you find the most frequent questions that people who are calling have?
Well, the most frequent questions deal with employment discrimination, and sadly, there's a lot of that going on. A lot of it are misunderstandings between employer and employee, or employee and employer, and then of course we get calls from the HR professional or a manager of a store. So we get questions that are very, very diverse.
So the first set of questions comes from people with disabilities who want to understand the protections, I suppose, provided by the ADA, right?
Right. They call to find out what their rights are and, what could I do regarding the situation. And, we provide them with neutral, helpful guidance that hopefully will make them better informed and more aware of how to deal with their situation.
I'll bet a lot of them call and they just want you to solve the problem. They want you to go
Yeah.
and shake up the employer, right?
Yeah, well, people, want an attorney to represent them, basically. It's what the bottom line is. They want someone to act for them because they just don't know what to do. And it's understandable. They're afraid to lose their job, and they want to try to get something going. And then, or we might get the calls from people who apply constantly to jobs and they're never given an interview, and they are trying to figure out what's wrong with me, what's wrong with them, with the employer.
So the first group, the people who call and want an attorney, we don't provide that service. I mean, what you do if they need
Right.
a personal attorney is make a referral to someone in the community who does that kind of work. But I think the first goal for people is to inform them, to empower them so that they understand exactly what their rights are and to the extent possible represent themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to emphasize that the majority of the people who call us, regardless of how difficult their issue might be, they don't really need an attorney. Not at the beginning of their quest to seek a remedy or to resolve a problem they're having at the office. So what I learned is that when they talk to me, they tell me all these different things that have been going on. Then I help them realize that you can do this yourself. You need to learn how to communicate. And I spend a great deal of time, Lex, teaching people how to communicate, believe it or not.
So the main issue that people have is not being able, first of all, they don't feel they're on good standing because they don't understand clearly what their rights and responsibilities are. And furthermore, I suppose some of them make assumptions about what the responsibilities of the employer might be, which
Right.
are inaccurate as well.
Yes, right. They, sometimes people think that they should have been accommodated without them having said anything, and that's incorrect. That's not a good approach. And then we get calls from employers who basically complain that the individual never said anything about having problems with a disability until they started losing points on their employment status,
So the best advice then is for people to talk with one another, to be open and honest.
Yeah.
If they do need in some interpretation of the law, they can call the ADA Center. That's 800-949-4232.
Right.
Diego, you're on that line 24/7?
Not 24/7, but we're there.
9
Definitely.
to 5. 9 to 5 weekdays.
Definitely 9 to 5.
All right. Diego, you mentioned a second class of questions that come from employers who really have, I suppose, the desire to respond appropriately to people's needs.
It's amazing how they really want to participate in the process. Regrettably, sometimes they have supervisors or people who work under them who supervise other staff, and it's their staff that's not poorly trained or not trained at all, and that's how the problems begin. And then they realize that the same thing that comes from the employee with a disability, that's that there just hasn't been communication. And so communication is a clear part of willing to make a concerted effort, to make things work, to discuss what's happening. And so that's a lot of it, that's what it's all about, is I explain to them how to communicate in writing if they have to do it that way. What kinds of things they have to think about as they think through their problem.
But Diego, don't you find that most employers really, their goal is to have a good employee who does work and can be very productive, right?
Yeah, right.
They don't get tied up in all the nuances that an employee might have as long as they can do their job.
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that I emphasize is that, I tell the employer, I tell them, look, you are paying somebody to work, and you need to get your money's worth. And that's the way it is, it's economics. And so I tell them, the law is also here to protect you as much as the employee, because you're entitled to get a working employee, someone who has a disability but who's qualified to perform those essential job functions.
Do you run into people with disabilities who feel like because they have a disability and they apply for a job, they should get that job?
Luckily, Lex, not that often, but yes, it does happen. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, and hopefully the ADA Center tries to educate, because, we have a training program as well that gets us into the field, and we go train professionals who do the vocational counseling work. We train attorneys, we train, all kinds of people in their professions. So hopefully that's creating that kind of awareness,
And again, people who want training should call the ADA Center.
The ADA Center, that's right.
800-949-4232, correct?
Right. Or they can go to our website, southwestada.org.
Southwestada.org.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Diego, recently now there have been some updates to the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. That was a
Right.
question we asked at the beginning of the show. In what year, Diego, did the ADA amendments pass and become law?
What year?
Yes, sir.
No, 2008.
All right.
And then,
knew we had an expert in the house. Diego, what basically did that law do, the amendments?
well, it significantly changed or basically we could say updated the definition of disability, where it made it clear that in particular employees were to no longer put a heavy emphasis or an initial emphasis on whether or not an individual has a covered disability under the law, where now the employer, as an example, has to look at whether they have made a reasonable effort to accommodate the individual who made a request for an accommodation. So the courts have a different standard now. They're going to be looking to see, did the employer make that effort?
See, I think that's the way the ADA should have been all along. I think
Right.
the intent really
was there.
by Congress and by those of us who worked on the law in the beginning was
Sure.
just to prevent discrimination. It didn't matter whether the discrimination was based strictly on a classifiable disability.
Exactly.
Employers shouldn't discriminate on any basis,
Right.
whether that be race, gender, disability, whatever.
Right.
Their goal should be to get the best employee that they can, and employees' goal should be to have a job without fear of discrimination based on whatever characteristic they may have. So I think it's much clearer now, and I know, Diego, that some of the most recent calls you've got had to do with swimming pools. Is that a part of the ADA amendments, or is that a part of some regulatory process?
Well, yeah, I mean, getting us into that topic area, because, the ADA doesn't just cover employment discrimination, right? It covers, the Title II entities, government agencies, and so forth. Yeah, in the private sector, meaning public accommodations like your typical hotel, they have swimming pools, like a health spa has a swimming pool, typically. And, of course, the ADA, part of those changes include a new architectural standards for accessible design, which, had not been updated since 1991. And so it was time for the Federal Access Board to promulgate those new changes after all the research that has been done and statistics and so forth. So then we have a new 2010 standard, what's called the 2010 standards, basically, for architectural design. And it now requires that pool lifts be installed for create accessible entry to typical swimming pools.
So it's just an example of the kinds of things that can be done now that couldn't be done 25 years ago, and that is, there are relatively inexpensive devices that can be installed adjacent to a swimming pool, particularly a public one in a hotel or a club or somewhere else, that will enable people who use wheelchairs, primarily others with mobility impairments and difficulty getting in and out of the water, to be lifted in and out more easily. It's a hydraulic lift generally, and it's simple technology. It's not too expensive, and the point is, if you've invested so much money in a swimming pool, why not spend a little bit more and make it accessible to all?
Well,
I think, Diego, I mean, the whole issue of accessibility to all, isn't that the bottom line?
It's definitely the bottom line. It's another amenity that places like a hotels, have.
But we're not talking about amenities. We're talking about access for all. And that's got to be the final issue that we deal with today on Focus on Abilities. Diego, I'll call you at 800-949-4232.
That's right.
Thank you for being on the show. Diego Demaya, Southwest ADA Center. I want to thank all of you for watching. the show? The answer was 2008 amendments to the ADA. I'm Lex Frieden. I'm glad you've been with us, and please tune in next time for more Focus on Abilities.